Tube amps generally have low output power ratings, but I've seen those ratings qualified with something like, but those are tube watts, implying that 1 watt from a tube amp somehow delivers more sound than 1 watt from a solid state amp, and therefore the low power is nothing to worry about. Hogwash! Watts are watts, sort of. At a given frequency, the same AC voltage across the same speaker terminals results in the same sound pressure level, or SPL, from the speaker, whether the voltage is produced by a tube or solid-state amp. Moreover, the usable power is often substantially lower than the power rating. Why? Output transformers, that's why. If that answer doesn't sound like an answer, then I need to explain just a bit about how tube amps summon the power to drive your speakers. The output transformer sits between the tubes and your speaker. On the tube side, the voltage is high enough to stop your heart and probably short out your speakers. But the tubes can't deliver both high voltage and high current. On the speaker side, your speaker is a current-hungry beast that can't tolerate high voltage. The output transformer converts the high voltage from the tubes into the high current needed to feed your speaker. Okay, awesome. So what's the problem? Well, the transformer has a limited range of frequencies over which it can do its job well. If the frequency is too low, deep bass, the signal gets distorted in an ugly, unpleasant way. If the frequency is too high, high treble, the signal gets attenuated or rolled off. Solving the bass problem requires more iron, but too much iron kills the high frequencies. Therefore, every output transformer represents a compromise solution to the problems at either end of the audible frequency range. You might point out that whereas some big organs actually play notes lower than the audible limit, no instruments play notes anywhere near the upper limit. Therefore, lose the upper end of the treble and save the lower end of the bass. Yes, that is the obvious solution. However, more iron is expensive. So, meeting a lower price point favors sacrificing bass. In this case, that lower price point might be over $1,000 US. High-end tube amps have big iron. You simply cannot get the lowest bass at full power without big iron. But maybe you don't need full power. Can smaller transformers reach the lowest lows at less than full power? Oh yeah. But it may be a lot less than full power. And you'd never know that from the amplifier specs, at least not the specs you're used to seeing for solid-state amps. Let's say you're shopping for amps, so you're comparing specs. And let's be realistic. On the one hand, you're looking at a solid-state amp that can deliver 75 watts per channel into 4 ohms, and the frequency range is 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. In that case, you should expect that amp to deliver at least 75 watts per channel into 4 ohms at any and all frequencies within that given range. This is, of course, a solid-state amplifier. It's a Nico TRM 750. It is rated at 75 watts per channel into 4 ohms. And the idea here is I'm just going to turn it up until we get to clipping. That is, until the tops and bottoms of the waveforms start to flatten out. And I want to look at the voltage at that level. And so voltage squared divided by 4 ohms in this case is the power output. I'll just slowly turn this up till we get to that point where it starts to clip. All right, so we can see right there at about 18 volts is where it's starting to clip. But that is about 85 watts. This amplifier is rated at 75 watts, so that's awesome. I'm going to reset the frequency down to 25 hertz and see whether, at 25 hertz, that is very near the lowest end of the frequency range, can I also get 85 watts or 75 watts per channel out of this amp? Turning it up, on the edge here, so back off a little bit. Okay, I'm over 16 volts or thereabouts, and you can see that if I turn it up a little bit more, at least one of the channels starts to distort. On the other hand, there's this nice tube amp. It only has 22 watts per channel, but those are tube watts after all. The frequency range in the specs is the same as for the solid state amp. The tube amp has less power, but it'll be fine. In fact, the tube amp specs are misleading. The power output is conventionally measured at 1 kilohertz, which is a violin note, and more than 4 octaves higher than the low E on a bass violin or guitar. The tube amp will probably deliver the same or similar power down to, say, 100 hertz, still more than an octave higher than that low E. Double the frequency to go up 1 octave. What about that low E, 40 hertz? Maybe, but the specs don't say. And at 20 hertz, you'd be lucky to get 1 watt without noticeable and ugly distortion. For some tube amps, you may find a spec called power bandwidth. That's the frequency range over which the amp can deliver sound with relatively low distortion, typically 1% or less, at a standard power level, typically 1 watt per channel. We'll test the jukebox amp, the AMI RAW R2620. Looking at the output from the jukebox amp, that's about 1 watt. So let's keep turning it up. Oh, there we go, clipping at 15.8 volts. Although we can see that the channel B is clipping, channel A is not. Now we go up to 18.2 volts and we see clipping on channel A. Down here at 13.6 volts, we see nice behavior. That's 23 watts per channel right there. Now again, this is at 1 kilohertz, and that's generally when you see the power rating on a tube amp, it is the maximum power given less than usually 1% total harmonic distortion at 1 kilohertz. You should not infer from that you can get anything like that kind of power down in the low frequencies. Let's just go down to 100 hertz, see what we get there. 13.6 was what we had before with a really nice looking waveform. And down here at 100 hertz, got just a bit less than that. So at 40 hertz, I'm getting a decent enough looking 8 watts. So here's 25 hertz. What did I say 2 watts was? That's over 2 watts. At 25 hertz, that might not sound too dreadful. Okay, tube amps don't deliver a lot of power. And what they can deliver for the whole orchestra is a lot less than what they can deliver for a violin. But surely there's an upside. And that upside is so compelling that the tube amp is the obvious choice, and therefore you should buy the tube amp. Right? No, there's nothing obvious about that choice. Rather, the right choice for you depends on a bunch of other factors. Like what? What factors? I'll get to those, but I think there's a more important question I need to answer first. Tubes are old technology. Surely the superior technology won out, and today's solid-state amp is light years beyond even the most advanced tube amp of the middle 20th century. But people still buy tube amps. Why? Are tube amps better under any circumstances? Yes. The first tube amp I brought home was in a Magnavox console before. It sounded really nice and I was psyched. But the difference between it and, say, the solid-state Dynaco amp that I had recently restored and modified was a difference in color. The Magnavox tube amp had that warm, rich, tubey sound, whereas the Dynaco SCA-80, right there, was sparkly in its detail. Fast forward to when I restored and modified a single-ended Magnavox tube amp and listened to it for the first time. Then my reaction was, oh. Oh? Oh what? Tube amp. Oh, I can hear the space between the notes. Oh, the singer's voice sounds like that. Like that good. And there's space around him and behind him. And there are spaces between notes. Now, I can explain those factors that I mentioned before. They're best explored as questions. First question, what kind of music do you listen to? If you only listen to violin music, then the bass problem isn't a problem. Thing is, I don't quite get the question because the music lovers I've known listen to many different genres, and I follow that rule. This question, then, it's not helpful for me. Second question, what role will this amp play in your life? Will it be the only amp in your only sound system? If so, and given the answer to the first question, I would caution against tube amps unless your speakers are truly special and super sensitive, like Klipsch, Lascalas, or corner horns. These are speakers that can produce over 100 decibels at 1 meter with 1 watt. For my friend who has Lascalas, the Flea Power amp will probably play as loudly as he'll ever want. Still, in case it doesn't, he has a solid state amp as backup. I'm getting it 1 kilohertz in both channels. Let's just see what kind of power we can get out of it. Now we start to see some rounding at the top and the bottom of the waveform at 5 volts. Let's back off that a little. So about 3 watts, which is about what I expect. At 40 hertz, it's doing 1 watt without any problem. And as we get to 2 watts, it's a bit messy. You see that at 5 volts, it's looking pretty bad. If you don't have very sensitive speakers over 100 dB with 1 watt at 1 meter, and you like loud music, I mean, at least occasionally, you like to turn it up, and then again, and again, then you're going to need a solid state amp. Unless you have unlimited funds, in which case this isn't going to be your only amp in your only system. What about me? I've got a main system in the living room. That system is for general family use and is probably used with the TV and game system more than for music. I also have systems in my home office, work office, and bedroom. The low-power Flea Power tube amp that made me say, "Oh," is in my office on campus. That's my favorite amp right now. So as you may have guessed from the difference between the length of my hair now and the length of the hair in the rest of the video, that footage was shot some time ago. I previously posted it as one of my first videos on this channel, and of course nobody saw it. Now that old video didn't really have a satisfactory ending, hence why I'm shooting this video right now. So what ending is needed? Well, should you buy a tube amp? And what about the bass problem? First of all, if you have enough money, you can buy your way out of the bass problem. If you have enough money, I recommend a Macintosh amplifier. You can't go wrong with a Mac. There may be other nicer amplifiers out there, but again, a Mac is going to be friggin' awesome. You can't go wrong. If you don't have the kind of money you need for a Mac, and I don't, I still do recommend a tube amp because they're awesome. So just get what you can afford and use it in the situation for which it's appropriate. Now, that may mean that you need more than one amp, in which case you need to be able to afford a tube amp plus whatever solid state amp you need for certain situations or settings. Or it may mean that, like me, you have several systems and you use tube amps in the situations for which their power is appropriate. Now, here in my office, I use the Flea Power amp because 3 watts per channel is plenty. I mean, more than enough. For, say, 1 watt at 40 hertz is plenty, because I really shouldn't be cranking it up that loud anyway. Although sometimes after hours I do. In my bedroom at home, 8.8 watts per channel or whatever is plenty. I have a 10 or 12 watt per channel amp in my office at home now, and that's plenty for that small space. But none of those would be enough power for my main system, which now has a 52 watt per channel receiver. If I didn't have multiple systems, I might have a tube power amp in my main system for listening to certain things at certain volumes, and switching to the solid state amp for everything else. I guess that's just my bit of advice for you. Again, I think tube amps are awesome for a number of reasons, but it's just important to understand their limitations. You don't want to buy an expensive tube amp and be disappointed. That would suck. I hope you've enjoyed the video or learned something, or both, and I hope I'll talk to you soon. Take care.